Hey guys, my name is Sean B2 and this is going to be my final Strihaven review video. So sorry for I did post this video earlier today, but it had a massive error regarding double major. The biggest problem is that card says not creature but creature spell, so I messed up. I said it was a way better than it actually was. Still going to be good in a few certain senses, but definitely wasn't one of the best cards in the set. So as I mentioned in that one, we're going to go through the top 5 cards along with an overrated card that I feel is pretty overrated, an underrated card I think that's going to improve in the future, and a card that I'm really just excited to brew with. So if there's anyone who has like a disagreement with me or thinks there should be a card that was on here or a card that is on here that shouldn't be, please comment that down below. I really appreciate and like to see that. Thank you guys for whoever is subscribed, and thank you guys for watching. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks. Hey guys, my name is Sean B, and this is going to be another Strihaven review video. This is going to be the final one. It's kind of going to be my culmination. It's going to be the top 5 cards and more, and the more is going to be the most overrated card in my opinion, the most underrated, a card that I think is pretty underrated, a card that I'm excited to brew with in the future. I don't know how powerful it's going to be, and another card that I think is going to go up in value, like it's going to become more powerful as time progresses. So I wanted to first apologize for a mistake I made. Lesson learned isn't in this format, so I mentioned it in one or two other videos and just disregard that. I finally thought they were going to put that into this, but they did not, so that's fine. But thank you guys to all who are subscribed. I really appreciate that. Thank you guys for watching, and if you enjoy, please like and subscribe. And also comment down below if there's any cards you think I missed, cards I undervalue, or cards I overvalued. So let's get into our first card, our most overrated, and it's Cody Vociferous Codex. Not going to read through it, but I talked about this when it was first spoiled, and it's kind of just, it's basically Cascade. You activate an ability, and then you flip cards until you flip an instant or sorcery with lesser value, and you can cast that without paying its card. And there's ways to do it with Freed from the Real, where basically you go infinite cast by repeatedly untapping and tapping it, and then you cast something and go through your entire library, and you use that basically a similar cascade mechanic. There's decks where you hypergenesis something into play. Maybe it is a Freed from the Real you hypergenesis into play, or you hypergenesis your like Thassa's Oracle and Leveler into play, whatever it may be. That's one of your win cons. Same thing with Living End. You get your Thassa's Oracle and your Leveler into the graveyard, or whatever other A plus B combo creatures into the graveyard. But so in theory it's good, but its biggest problem is it's basically Hermit Druid in the command zone, incredibly glass cannoned, and a lot worse than Hermit Druid. The main difference is Hermit Druid, when you do activate, you do go all in, so you do have no cards in your library. But Hermit Druid's 2 mana, it costs 1 to activate. This is 3 mana, it costs 4 to activate. Exposed to a little bit less creature removal, but also exposed to all artifact removal, which makes it pretty glass cannony. And it's also not as fast as Hermit Druid. It doesn't work as well with haste enablers. Like I have a default example here of Torch Courier. It doesn't really work well with these because whereas Hermit Druid you can go pay 2 mana, you have Torch Courier, you sack it, you tap it, you pay 1 to tap it. You mill your library, you maybe you go Necrotic Ooze if you're in like green black or Abzan, or you just grab Oracle with an empty library if you're in Sultai and you win. Whereas Cody, you sacrifice Courier and you still have to pay an additional 4 mana just to begin the combo. So it's pretty hard to do. It's a lot more difficult than Hermit Druid too, and also pretty glass cannony. And as I said, exposed to creature and artifact removal. It does dodge the first part of a braid, but then gets hit by the second part. So I think it's more of a good meme commander, more casual, but because it's basically it has to survive a turn cycle, and sitting with a Hermit Druid in the play and hoping to survive his turn cycle is pretty unlikely, and this is even less likely because your opponents basically know you're going to be playing this because it's in the command zone. They're like, oh, he played turn one Soul Ring. He's moving on to his next turn. Okay, he's gonna play Cody. Let's maybe tutor for a removal spell or hold up interaction. So it's even more predictable than Hermit Druid. So for the underrated card, it might not be the most underrated, it's hard to say. It's Illuminate History, and I'll actually read this one off. Discard any number of cards, then draw that many cards. Then if there are 7 more cards in your graveyard, create a 3/2 red and white spirit token. So we had Valakut Awakening back from Zendikar Rising, which is pretty similar. Put any number of cards from your hand on the bottom of your library. Draw that many cards +1. The big difference is Valakut Awakening costs less. It is an instant, which which is better than being a sorcery. But instead of discarding the cards, you put them into the graveyard, and I think, or you put them into your library. I think depending on what deck you're playing, this is actually going to be worse. Putting them into the graveyard is actually pretty good, and it's kind of like this Wheel of Fortune effect where you just get to put a bunch of cards into the yard, which is pretty powerful. There's a lot of things where you want to put 7 or more cards into your graveyard. A lot of decks that play Underworld Breach, so there is cases where it's like I would rather have this card in the graveyard. Maybe I'm in my Tibalt list. I would rather have my Mox Opal in the graveyard than on the way bottom of my library if I'm going to be sending that back because I need to draw some other card. And so having it in the graveyard is actually more powerful in a decent number of decks than on the bottom of your library. And again, just Yawgmoth's another effect where it's easy to replay cards from the bottom of your library or from your graveyard rather than your bottom of your library because then you have to redraw into them. So, and obviously we have cards like World Gorger Dragon, which you want in your graveyard to combo to win the game with, and other reanimation cards like Razaketh. You want to put these cards into the graveyard, and you don't want to put them on the bottom of your library. So it provides you a discard outlet, which is pretty powerful, especially in these reanimation style of decks. That also draws you as many cards as you potentially need. So it's going to be good off like an Ad Nauseam, maybe even off a Necropotence or a Peer into the Abyss. And I think another thing is the 3/2 red and white spirit. If you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, and if you play the right amount of cards, especially like even if you don't discard that many, if you play the right amount of fetch lands and stuff like that, you'll easily have 7. And so this spirit actually is pretty nice. Like Razaketh I mentioned, it works as a sacrifice creature to Razaketh, allowing you to search your library for a card. Then it also works with like Culling the Weak effects, Infernal Plunge, stuff like that. Diabolic Intent. Basically, you don't have to then play a creature. You just get a free creature to use for these effects. So I think it's pretty powerful. And it's an underrated card that I think is going to see some play. For the card that I think is going to improve in the future is Tempted by Auric, and it's basically just Gilded Drake. You do get access to only creature with mana value 3 or less. But cEDH is a format of efficiency, and most creatures have mana value, CMC, whatever you want to call it, of 3 or less. Hits what I consider to be the big 3: Opposition Agent, Hull Breacher, and Drannith Magistrate, kind of the big 3 creatures that a lot of people play and are very game impacting. Could be like the big 4, maybe you want to say Collector Roof, big 5, Thalia, whatever you want to say. It steals a lot of these important creatures that most decks want to deal with either by removing them, but it's actually better to steal your opponent's opposition agent than to remove it because now you're locking them out, whereas they were locking you out before. So it also has the Planeswalker ability, and Narset and is alright, and I guess Ashiok you'd also consider. These see some play in certain decks, and Ashiok's more of a meta call. If you're playing a really wheel thiefy deck and you want that extra thief, I guess Narset works. So maybe, and everyone runs like Windfall, Time Twister if you're in blue, Wheel of Fortune, and potentially Wheel of Misfortune if you're in red. So having cards like Narset that work well with thieves and being able to steal them, and yeah. And then Ashiok obviously stops opponents from searching their library, so it's nice to steal that and lock your opponents out of the game even more. I think the big thing though with this card is commanders. Everyone's like the top commanders I actually looked on. Like whatever your opinion on the cEDH deck list database, I looked at it. It was like 50 out of 100 and something commanders that were listed. I just went through like deck by deck, and if they had one commander, if they were like a partner deck, those other 3 I checked it off. They had it was almost 50% of commanders and this is just saying like all the decks that people consider to be competitive, and that's like not even inclusive, like not fully inclusive of all the decks. But there's a lot of 3 mana commanders, like over 50%, and that's like saying that if there's one of each deck, but there's tons of Tymna decks, tons of Thrasios decks. There's tons of these decks that play low mana commanders because efficiency, as I said, is key, and a lot of these decks really rely on their commanders. Like Thrasios, they rely on as a win con, Tymna as one of their main value engines. So being able to steal it and take it for yourself is good. I think Tempted by Auric is also going to improve in the future as like we see a shift to more mid range. Like right now we're kind of in that shift towards like Turbo is being countered by Stacks. And if Stacks ever starts to take a hold of the metagame, then it's going to shift towards a really mid-range metagame. Or if you're even already in a mid-range metagame like your local meta, this card's going to be pretty good because you can steal those high-value mid-range either creatures, as I mentioned, maybe planeswalkers, and definitely commanders. So the most card I'm excited to brew around is Rushed Rebirth, and it's choose a target creature. When that creature dies this turn, search your library for a creature card with lesser mana value, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. This card immediately thinks of Birthing Pod, and I immediately thought of A plus B combos. So whatever, if you could have a card that you get a creature, you say you have a 4-drop, you get a 5-drop. If you can have a 3 or less drop that wins you the game along with your 5-drop, then it works. I immediately, being a big fan of Kiki-Jiki and playing it in decks that I play, just because it's a pretty solid, compact win con with a lot of cards. You get Kiki-Jiki, you sack whatever 4-drop you have. Maybe it's a Felidar Guardian if you're in some white deck. Maybe it's like your commander, Tana the Bloodsour, whatever it may be, you get Kiki-Jiki. And then, say you're in blue, you grab Pestermite. You're in green, you grab Hyrex Tower Scout. And so basically, it works in this way where if you have A plus B combos, where with Birthing Pod, where one creature is one greater than the mana cost of the stacked creature, and the other one is any mana value less than it, or any CMC, whatever you want to call it. It's weird to see that changed after all this time, but whatever that may be, or whatever you want to refer to it as long as it's lower than, you're able to assemble a lot of A plus B combos. And maybe you need a Collector Oof, but you only have a 3-drop in play. You can't sacrifice a 1-drop to find it. So, but you can sacrifice a 3-drop and then cast, and you can use Rush Rebirth to grab the Collector Oof along with whatever 4-drop you want to grab. So this works with a lot of cards like Hull Breachers, any powerful creature you want to be in play. Maybe you need to lock your opponents out, or in the case of Hull Breach, you want to wheel. If it's a powerful creature that you normally couldn't tutor for because your creature you already have creatures with too high CMC, then you can use Rush Rebirth to grab those lower CMC creatures that you still may need, whether to combo off in the case of Kiki-Jiki or to lock your opponents out of the game or slow them down. And then I thought of it also in the case of Protean Hulk. If you've gotten your Protean Hulk in play, Rush Rebirth can be used as kind of a way to protect your combo a little bit. Like, so you have a sack outlet in play, you cast Rush Rebirth targeting Protean Hulk, then you sack it. And like at worst, you can get like a Sylvan Safekeeper to protect your combo. Maybe you get a Phyrexian Delver, so you can reanimate Hulk and even get more pieces to a combo to protect it even more. And then sack it. So it basically just adds you some additional protection to your Protean Hulk piles, which I think might be needed, but Protean Hulk decks tend to want to be as efficient as possible, so it might be a little bit slow. But I definitely want to try to build around this card, especially in the Birthing Pod style. I'm currently working on a 4-color Birthing Pods list that sans white. Definitely considering some options, and I think it's going to be a really fun card to brew around. So let's get into the top 5. Our first card is Venerable Warsinger, and I'm going to read these ones out. It's Vigilance, Trample. Whenever Venerable Warsinger deals combat damage to a player, you may return target creature with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, or X is the amount of damage Venerable Warsinger dealt to that player. So it's a pretty good card. One of the big problems is with playing stacks is when your opponent deals with your stacks, you're kind of getting far behind because they've set themselves up to deal with your stacks and then progress their game, and now you're like a turn behind them. But with cards like Venerable Warsinger, you're able to return your stacks to the battlefield, so you're able to kind of main phase 1, play everything you can during main phase 1, and then during combat, go grab your stacked pieces back from the graveyard and have them online, shutting your opponents down. And maybe you're not into stacks, maybe that's not what you're playing. At worst, it can just be good with a ETB creature like Dockside, any ETB creature 3 or less. With Dockside, and with this, you just grab like Dockside, you create a bunch of treasures, so it ramps you, it does whatever you need. It's a really flexible card that can grab whatever creature is most important. Maybe it's a Imperial Recruiter from the graveyard so you can tutor for another combo piece, whatever that may be. Maybe it's your Dockside, you want a lot of treasures, or maybe it's a specific stacks piece that you need. So there's a lot of stuff you can do like that. Then it's even good with cards like Hull Breacher if you're in some sort of Jeskai X stack, Jeskai with green. Like maybe you're playing an Advantage Thrasios list. You're able to grab your Hull Breacher back out of the graveyard that was already destroyed. So it kind of functions as like a repeatable low mana creature reanimation effect, and that allows you to grab your most powerful low mana creature from the battlefield. And yeah, I think this is going to be really good in decks like Winota. It obviously triggers Winota because it's a Spirit Cleric. And Vigilance Trample is kind of evasion with Trample. Like, you're obviously, if you do Trample, you're going to get a lower mana creature back if it gets blocked. But still, Trample gives it some additional evasion and Vigilance. Maybe if you're in a really stacksy game, you might get swung back on. So having the Vigilance allows it to block pretty well, which is nice too. I think it's also going to be good in Birthing Pod, just like I was meaning to mention, because if you have like repeatedly Birthing Pod creature, like you have a 3-drop and your combo is 2 4-drops. I don't know what that is. Maybe it's actually 2 2-drops, and your combo is a 2 3-drops. Whatever your combo may be, you can use Warstinger to re-grab that combo piece, that creature that you want to sacrifice it once again, do it again, and just continue to find a creature to sacrifice each turn. Going to be really good with like Rule of Law and stuff like that in play, and allows you to bring back your like fodder creatures for stuff like Birthing Pod. And then again we have Tymna, which I think is a really powerful commander. And obviously, Venerable Warstinger works well with Tymna because you get to grab a creature back from your graveyard, which can then attack and gain value through Tymna. And you also then get to draw a card, and Trample, as I said, is a pseudo-evasion effect. Not really evasion, but sort of. So yeah. And then, as I mentioned, Birthing Pod, you can grab your fodder creatures for a Diabolic Intent. For a Call in the Week, you can just re-grab your Memnite, your 0-drop Memnite. You can grab your 1-drops, your 2-drops, and just bring them back to sacrifice to cards like this. Allows you to kind of conserve your mana and not have to spend on casting them or getting another one of them to sacrifice. Our next card is going to be our first card with Magecraft. It's going to be Stormkill and Artist. And so it gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control. And then whenever you cast their copy instant or sorcery spell, create a treasure token. So it works really well with Chain of Smog. That's like the big card everybody's talking about. It's spiked in price. Basically, you cast this targeting yourself. You do go Hellbent when you do it. You do discard your entire hand, but you go infinite treasures in this line. And so it's pretty similar to Animate Dead / Warlord Dragon, which is kind of like right now the main red-black infinite mana combo that generates infinite mana of any color. And we see a lot of WGD decks, whether it be the classic of Croaxa or something new like Jessica and another black commander, whatever that may be. And the big difference between this doesn't fold to cards like Rest in Peace and Grafdigger's Cage. You do have to cast 2 different spells, so you are more prone to interaction, and Stormkill Artist has to stick around, so you are prone to creature-based hate, but you aren't prone to the graveyard hate that some decks run, especially certain decks and certain metas run these cards a lot to deal with what they're playing the most. And as I said, we have the classics, like similarly, I think WGD decks might actually even just run this as a secondary combo. I think some, like Thraxa, some decks even already run Chain of Smog, just as a way to disrupt their opponent's hands and slow the game down, make sure their opponents can't combo off for them. So just throwing Stormkill Artist in gives it another additional infinite mana combo. And I mentioned Jessica too, just another WGD commander that can win with it. And then the third one I wanted to mention was Extus. The sorcery part, I'm not going to explicitly read it out, but basically says if you get infinite mana and you're in your pre-combat main phase, you would infinite tokens that attack and then deal damage and win the game. So, yeah, so this goes infinite with Magecraft too. You just go, again, you can basically just go infinite treasures and then cast the second part infinite times. So another WGD commander. And I think this combo is another also similar to Auric Salvators and Lionside Diamond. It's basically the same amount of mana, but again, it doesn't fold to rest. It doesn't fold to these graveyard effects like Rest in Peace and in this case Weathered Runestone. It doesn't fold to those. It is more interactable on the stack, like such as a miscast, counter target instant or sorcery spell, and then a Grafdigger's Cage, obviously as I mentioned, and other graveyard hate stops. Auric Salvagers, not Grafdigger's Cage specifically, but other graveyard hate like Weathered Runestone does. But so both are they are both like 6 mana to really pull off, and they both are affected by removal. But I think this is really going to be meta dependent. If you're in a Mardu deck, which of these is your maybe you're probably running Wolgrudge Dragon as your main infinite mana combo, which of these is your secondary infinite mana combo. If you're playing a lot of discard synergies, probably going to be this one, or if you're playing treasured synergies, probably going to be this one too. Then I want to talk about the big commander, Corvold. If you're playing Corvold, this is probably a really card you're hoping for, because this card again wins with Corvold, because basically you just sacrifice those treasures with Corvold out and draw through your entire deck. You play whatever combo it is that you're going to win from there and win. And I wanted to also mention Mayhem Devil, because if you go infinite treasures, Mayhem Devil's a really good card. We've seen like Corpse Die and Dockside with Mayhem Devil as a win con in some decks. But if you go infinite treasures with Mayhem Devil, you just sack them and ping your opponents. And this is like kind of a Corvold tech, because you draw through your deck, you play Devil, and then you basically just sack all of the rest of your infinite number of treasures to ping all your opponents. Okay guys, let's get into our third best card. This is called Wandering Archaic, and it's a 5 mana creature avatar, and whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery spell, they may pay 2. If they don't, you may copy that spell, you may choose new targets for the copy. So the early stages of a cEDH game, and throughout the game in general, a lot of instants and sorceries are cast. Starting the game, your opponents might be playing Vampiric Tutor, or Gamble, Whirly Tutor, whatever tutor they're playing, they're starting the game off playing a tutor most likely, or some other instant like a Ponder just to kind of set their game plan up, run out their mana rocks, get ready to start the game, and try to win as fast as possible. And so Wandering Archaic's ability makes them either pay 2 or let you tutor 2. And the big thing is Wandering Archaic's pretty expensive, but there's a lot of fast mana in this format, like a lot. And there's a lot of decks that are set up to cast cards like Ad Nauseam on turn 1 or 2. And so that's why I'm going to kind of call this the colorless Ad Nauseam, because it is 5 mana, and it's going to be kind of game changing if you're able to resolve it. It's kind of like a Thorn of Amethyst. Like, you could have an incredible strategy, 3 mana rocks in your first hand, or in this case with like Wandering Archaic, like a ritual, a ritual, and 2 tutors. You're gonna grab your A plus B combo, win the game on turn 2, whatever it may be. And these cards just completely stop the game from happening. Obviously, Wandering Archaic, as I said, is a little bit overcosted, being 5 mana, whereas Thorn of Amethyst is 2. I do think that it's still going to be a pretty powerful effect, because fast mana is key. So, and then like it's kind of like a Rhystic Study too. It's like a lot of the times especially early game when people are setting up, if you drop a turn 1 Rhystic Study or another card, Mystic Moor or Smothering Tithe, no one's gonna be paying for them. You're just gonna be generating a value. This is kind of like the best of those effects. It is the most expensive, but it is inherently powerful, just because cEDH is played at instant speed. It is played at instant and sorcery speed. Some decks run less than 10 creatures, some are really creature heavy. So, but there's a lot of decks that run like less than 10 creatures, and their majority of their decks is instants and sorceries. And I just said, and it's kind of like God Pharaoh Statue too. God Pharaoh Statue is basically an I win the game card a lot of the time, especially if your opponents can't deal with it immediately. There will be some times where someone will win through it, maybe they have one combo piece in the battlefield and cast the other one. So, but making them pay either 2 extra in God Pharaoh Statue's case, and with Wandering Archaic, If they don't pay the 2 extra, you just get the spell. So if you drop a turn 1 Water Archaic, you go like mana, you drop your bunch of mana rocks and stuff like that. You're in a deck that's pretty heavy on mana rocks and rituals. And then you get this out. You get all of your opponent's tutors to basically refill your hands. You get all of their cantrips, all of their like wheels, which obviously isn't that great because copying a wheel just means you wheel your hand again. But in some cases, I guess it could be good. And then you have ad nauseum. With the format, as I've said, that I think it might shift towards more mid-rangey soon. But right now, there's a lot of decks that still try to win it with ad nauseum. And if you have this out, your opponent has to choose between 2 options: ad nauseum through this or paying 7. Peer into the Abyss for 7 feels good. Ad naus for 7 does not feel good. And it's a lot harder to come by. So it really shuts down strategies like that. So it works in a way in like a stacks piece in that say. And say they do try to combo through this. You get your ad naus, you resolve your ad naus first, you flip however many cards, and maybe you don't even need to win the game. You have the win in hand. You just go until you find like a free counter spell and then counter their ad nauseum. Find that force of will or whatever it may be, and then counter it. And then talking about force of will, this kind of acts as your opponent as protection for your spells too. If your opponent is going to play their force of will, they also have to pay an additional 2. So it's like force of will is not now a free counter spell; it's a 2-mana counter spell. Which, as we can see by the fact that people are cutting cards like Counterspell and Mana Drain from their decks because they are slower and they do require double blue. This requires colorless. But if they don't pay that, then you just counter their spell because you get your own copy of it. So that's where it's going to be inherently powerful in a lot of these situations. And I do address that it is a pretty high costed card, but I think if you're able to play ad nauseum on turn 2, you're able to play this card on turn 2, especially because it doesn't require you to have double black. 5 colorless is not that hard when you have Mana Vault, Mana Crypt, Soul Ring, Grim Monolith, and that's just listing a few. There's so many colorless producing artifacts that are played in this format. So I think this is going to be an inherently powerful card, both as like kind of a stacks piece, a way to shut your opponent's win cons down. It is overcosted, but I think you can get around that pretty easily. And then one more thing is Assassin's Trophy in this case. If your opponent ever wants to remove Wandering Archaic, they either have to pay 2 additional in the case like with Force of Will, or you just get to trade an effect for it. So they're paying 4 to remove your 5-drop and sacrificing one of their permanents. Or they're either paying 4 to kill a 5-drop, which is obviously somewhat efficient, or they're sacrificing a permanent and paying 2 to kill your permanent and then give you a basic land and then ramp themselves also. But it's like this weird interaction where if your opponent is willing to kill this, they either have to pay the 2, which a lot of the times, unless they have a lot of additional mana, they're not going to be able to pay the 2. So they're going to get shut down by this. So yeah, let's move on to our next card. It is a Witherbloom Apprentice. This is kind of like the namesake Magecraft card, because this is the infinite combo with Chain of Smog. Unlike Storm Knights, it just does straight up win you the game. But it's a green-black creature. It's a 2/2 that has Magecraft, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, copy it. Each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. So once again, we have a card that wins the game straight out with Chain of Smog. And it's kind of like this second Thassa's Oracle combo, except way worse, because unlike Oracle and Tainted Pact, you can't resolve Tainted Pact on 1 turn and then cast your Oracle on the next turn. And you can't do something with like Demonic Consultation similarly, where you can't resolve one on 1 turn and then the other on the other. Or you can't say, if you know you have like an Oracle on the bottom because you scryed it there, you can't Demonic Consultation for Oracle. It's a lot worse, but it's still this A plus B combo that's 4 or less mana. And it actually is easier to cast. We've seen a lot of decks move towards Sunken Ruins, which is a pretty bad land. Mostly because if you don't have any other rocks out that tap for blue or back, it's just a bad colorless land that doesn't do anything. But it does have the ability to tap for double blue, which makes Oracle less awkward to cast. But unlike Oracle, Witherbloom Apprentice is not resilient to creature removal, because Oracle is a cast ETB trigger. So when you cast it, as long as the spell resolves, it enters the battlefield. It's a trigger on the stack. It doesn't matter if they remove it right after. That doesn't affect it. Whereas Witherbloom Apprentice, they can just respond to you trying to combo off and just destroy it. And then you're just chain of smogging yourself and discarding 2 cards. But it's in another combo that's a 2-card combo under 4 mana, which is really what decks want to play because it's efficient. And as I talked about with Wandering Archaic and other cards in this, efficiency is key. You want to be you want to be either playing a deck that generates a lot of mana so you can win with more expensive win cons, or you want to be playing a deck that just is fast and can win with these low mana win cons. And it's also pretty good because green-black is historically known for Protean Hulk lines, whether that be a Valraz Hulk, Hapatra Hulk. They basically play the same Protean Hulk line with Lesser Masticore and Disciple of the Vault and Malira. But it gives these decks, like those decks, a new win con. It gives them a secondary win con for like a deck like Naf of the Gilt Leaf, which historically has never had a win con really. Might not always be the most competitive deck, but it gives green-black decks like Naf and even Hapatra, if it doesn't want to be on Hulk, a secondary win con that's pretty viable because all you need is 2 cards. And it's really going to be good with cards like Razaketh because Life Death there's already a lot of Razaketh lines, and with Life Death all you need is 4 mana and 4 mana and 2 creatures on the battlefield. And if you have more creatures or whatever, then basically you just gotta get 4 mana, and you can use Razaketh to combo off with this and make it pretty easy to find your combo pieces. And green-black, you do have a lot of access to tutors too outside of Razaketh. So I think it's going to see play in these types of decks, and along with some kind of like bad farm lists, Iker Shadiki lists, where you want to be playing this is like a good new win con because you don't have Breach and you don't have Oracle. So I think it's going to give a lot of decks a good win con outside of especially Protean Hulk. Our final card is going to be Vanishing Verse, a white and a black source instant that says exile target monocolored permanent. So 2 mana removal spells are mainly seen in green-black. We have Abrupt Decay and Assassin's Trophy, which I mentioned earlier. Abrupt Decay being the better of the two, mostly because Can't Be Countered is pretty relevant. A lot of counter spells flowing around, a lot of free interaction. Like, even if your opponent is completely tapped out, they still can interact with you with like it's even more now. Fierce Guardianship, Deflecting Swat. Obviously, this doesn't affect. The SWAT can change the target of this, but Fierce Guardianship. There's just a bunch of kind of these instant speed interaction counter spells that don't cost any mana, so not being able to be countered is pretty powerful. And destroying target permanent with 3 or less, that's really that's not the most relevant because I mentioned before the problem permanents are a lot of the times 3 or less mana. And then Assassin's Trophy destroys any permanent, but it gives them a basic land untapped. And you never want to ramp your opponents. It doesn't feel good. People play Tainted Pact mana bases, but even though Blood Moon's kind of fallen out of favor a lot right now, you're always still going to play a few basics just because, obviously, Assassin's Trophy, and because in the case you do face a deck that's most likely on Blood Moon or Magus of the Moon, you can go grab them and not just fold the game. So as I said, it hits the big 3 along like Abrupt Decay does in Hull Breacher, Opposition Agent, and Drannith Magistrate. Big 4 if you want to include Collect Roof, depending on what strategy you're playing. And it exiles them, which is the biggest part of this. A lot of decks play reanimation effects, whether it be Reanimate, whether it be Animate Dead, even if they're not a Reanimator style. And some decks are. Some decks do like to play Reanimation with Razakeths. But your Hull Breacher, you want to bring your Hull Breacher back. You have a wheel in hand. You set your Hull Breacher up, you plan on wheeling next turn. Well, someone killed it, but I have Reanimate, so I can get it back. And so Vanishing Verse, being able to exile these problem permanents, basically guarantees that they cannot come back to the game. Your opponents cannot reanimate them, which is, as I said, relevant because I don't even play Reanimator decks, but if I'm playing a black deck, I'm probably throwing Reanimate into the mix, and maybe Animate Dead, Dance of the Dead, Necromancy, one of those cards. I'm throwing it into the mix because I know how inherently powerful it's going to be in my list. And then it doesn't hit artifacts, but it does hit cards like Rhystic Study, Underworld Breach, and again, Underworld Breach is one of those cards that allow you to cast cards from your graveyard. So it is good against Underworld Breach strategies 2, and it does exile breach itself. It's good against cards like Smothering Tithe and Eternal Witness, because everyone plays Eternal Witness a lot of the time. I agree. It is a slow card, but being able to grab your win con back from the graveyard is important. Could be even something like Savine's Reclamation or something Noxious Revival seems a lot of play. Regrowth. People want to get those powerful creatures or enchantments or other colored permanents back into play, because that's a lot of the times one of their win cons. I think it does struggle against cards like Thrasios and Timnom and uses the default 2-color commanders, because they do see a lot of play, but there's a lot of multi-color commanders. But in most decks are going to be running creature removal anyways, especially if you're going to be running in white. You are going to be running cards like Swords to Plowshares, because it's just you have a lot of creature removal in general, and you probably should be running a lot of creature-based removal. Decks don't always win off creature-based combos, but a lot of the times their value engine is a creature, whether it be the commander or whether it be a card that synergizes well with the commander, such as like a Razaketh, where it is it's going to be how you're going to gain value from the deck. And then it doesn't interact with artifacts, as I mentioned, like Thorn of Amethyst or Winter Orb, just two basically default stacks pieces. But once again, this is going to be a meta call, and a lot of decks already play artifact and enchantment based hate, whether it be like a creature based strategy where they play it more in the like the main deck as like a Yisan or like a Perthing pod deck. Tons of decks already play artifact based haste. Yisan's not a good example because he's a mono green creature, but you're always going to be playing Universal Hate anyways, and I'm not really saying play this card over Assassin's Trophy or play this card over Abrupt Decay. Definitely not over Abrupt Decay. Play it alongside the two of them, especially if you're in a meta with a lot of black decks that tend to reanimate their creatures. Because even if you're just hitting a Dockside with this because you're playing Corvold, you exile their Dockside. Now their win con's basically out of the deck. So just a lot of stuff exile does that other cards do not. So I think this card is going to be pretty powerful, just being able to hit a lot of monocolored permanents and removing them completely from the game and shutting down your opponent's win cons. So that's going to conclude this list of my top 5 cards. As I did explain in the intro, I did record this afterwards because I made some mistakes, but I think overall the video went well, and I would just like to thank everybody for watching. I really appreciate that, and I hope you enjoyed this video. So, thanks.